Welcome to the Heartbreak Stories channel. Some betrayals hide in plain sight for decades, right inside the life you thought you knew. This is a story about a man who had to use his own professional skills to uncover the truth about his marriage. Let's take a walk and listen to this story.
My wife insisted on taking a separate car to her parents' anniversary party. On the way there, my daughter whispered, "Dad, Mom doesn't know I found this." I spent 32 years tracking financial fraud. Now I had to audit my own marriage, and the numbers were devastating. My name is Winston Hawkins. I'm 61 years old, recently retired, and the man who just spent the last year of his life quietly dismantling a marriage he thought was solid as bedrock. Lorraine and I had been together for 34 years, married 32 of them. We'd built a good life in Asheville, North Carolina, a colonial-style house on a quiet street, a daughter we were both proud of, a routine that felt comfortable and earned. I'd stepped away from the corporate world 2 years prior, turned in my badge at Meridian Financial Group, and started spending my mornings in the woodshop I'd built behind the garage. Life felt settled. That October morning, Lorraine came downstairs already dressed. New blouse I hadn't seen before, hair done up carefully, perfume I didn't recognize. She told me she'd drive herself to her parents' anniversary dinner. Said she wanted to stop by the florist beforehand and didn't want to make everyone wait. It wasn't an unreasonable explanation, but something about the way she said it, too quick, too rehearsed, made me file it away in that part of my brain that never fully retired. Our daughter, Cassie, rode with me. She was 30, working as a project coordinator for an architecture firm downtown, sharp as they come. She'd driven up from her apartment that morning and didn't have her own car in Asheville that weekend. We'd been on the road about 15 minutes, easy conversation about her new apartment, when she went quiet in a way that wasn't like her. I glanced over. She was staring at something in her hand, a small white card, the kind hotels put in those little paper sleeves. "Dad," she said quietly, not looking up. "Mom doesn't know I found this." I kept my eyes on the road. "Where'd you get that?" It was in the side pocket of Mom's tote bag, the one she leaves in the back seat. Cassie set the card on the console between us, face up. I was looking for a pen. I picked it up at the next red light. A hotel key card. No hotel name printed on it, just a small handwritten note tucked behind the magnetic strip. 2 words in neat, confident script. "Victor, 4 o'clock." The light turned green. I placed the card in my jacket pocket without a word. "Dad, I heard you, Cass." My voice came out steadier than I expected. "I've got it." She didn't push. That was one of the things I'd always admired about my daughter. She knew when to let something breathe. The rest of the drive, I kept my expression neutral and my hands relaxed on the wheel, the same way I used to sit across from CFOs who thought they'd buried their tracks deep enough. Inside, the old machinery was already turning. Victor, 4 o'clock. Not a name from our social circle. Not a contractor, not a neighbor, not anyone Lorraine had ever mentioned. Frank and Norma's house was a sprawling ranch-style property outside of town, strung with lights for the occasion. 40 years of marriage. The yard was already half full of cars when we arrived. Lorraine's silver Accord was parked near the front, which meant she'd beaten us there. She hadn't stopped at any florist. Her hands were empty when she met us at the door, cheeks flushed, smile bright and immediate. "You made good time," she said, kissing my cheek. "Roads were clear," I replied, returning the smile without effort. She turned to greet Cassie, and in that half second I watched her eyes, just a flicker of something checking, measuring, landing on my jacket pocket where the card sat. Then it was gone, replaced by the warm hostess expression she wore like a second skin at family events. Inside, the house smelled of pot roast and autumn candles. Frank Turner, 78 and sharp-eyed, shook my hand with a firm grip. "Winston, good to see you. 34 years for you two next year, am I right?" "That's right, Frank," I answered. "Time flies when you're not paying attention," he said with a laugh. I smiled and agreed. But across the room, near the fireplace, a man I didn't recognize was talking to Lorraine's brother. Broad-shouldered, silver-templed, well-dressed in the particular way of men who are used to being the most accomplished person in the room. He held a glass of red wine and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who'd walked into 100 rooms just like this one. When Lorraine crossed the room to say hello to her mother, The man's eyes tracked her movement for exactly 2 seconds before he looked away. 2 seconds too long. I accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray, found a position near the bookshelf with clean sight lines to both the entrance and the fireplace, and settled in. 32 years of auditing had taught me one thing above everything else. The truth was always in the details, and I had all evening to collect them. His name, I learned within the first hour, was Dr. Victor Rhodes. Lorraine's brother Gary made the introduction without any apparent awareness of what he was handing me. He pulled me aside near the buffet table, nodding toward the silver-templed man by the fireplace. "Winston, you know Victor? He's been Don and Frank's physician for years. Brilliant guy. Runs the cardiology practice over on Merriweather." Gary clapped me on the shoulder. "Come on, I'll introduce you." I followed without hesitation. If there was one thing 32 years of forensic auditing had drilled into me, it was this: you learn more about a man by shaking his hand and watching his eyes than by reading 100 pages about him. Dr. Victor Rhodes was 61, my age exactly, with the kind of composed, authoritative presence that came from decades of delivering difficult news in calm tones. He extended his hand with a practiced smile. "Winston Hawkins, I've heard a lot about you," he said smoothly. "All good, I hope," I replied, holding his grip a half-second longer than necessary, watching. There was just a flicker. His eyes shifted left toward Lorraine, then back to me. Controlled, but not quite controlled enough. "Frank speaks very highly of you," Victor offered. "Frank's a generous man," I answered, and excused myself to refresh my drink. I spent the next 40 minutes cataloging. It was second nature by now. The same patient observation I'd once applied to tracking falsified expense reports across subsidiary accounts. Victor Rhodes moved through the party with easy familiarity, greeting people by name, laughing at the right moments. But 3 times in those 40 minutes, his attention found Lorraine across the room. And twice, Lorraine's hand rose briefly to her necklace, a gesture I recognized. She only did that when her pulse was elevated. Cassie appeared at my elbow, near the dessert table, keeping her voice low. "You know who he is?" "Cardiologist?" I murmured. "Victor Rhodes. Apparently he's been your grandparents' doctor for years." My daughter's jaw tightened. "How convenient, isn't it?" I picked up a small plate and moved toward the appetizers, keeping my tone even. "Go enjoy the party, Cass. This is your grandparents' evening." She gave me a look that said she was nowhere near done with the subject, but she respected the instruction and moved away. At 7:15, I watched Lorraine excuse herself from a conversation near the windows. She slipped down the hallway toward the back of the house, toward the guest bathroom, which also happened to be adjacent to the side door that opened onto the garden. 2 minutes later, Victor Rhodes set his wine glass on a side table and followed the same path. I checked my watch. I did not follow. Instead, I moved to the window overlooking the garden and stood at an angle that kept me visible from inside the room, but gave me a partial view of the stone path below. They stood together near the garden bench for 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Not touching, talking quietly, quickly. At one point, Victor's head dipped toward hers. Not intimate exactly, but close. Familiar. The kind of close that takes years to build. When Lorraine returned, her expression was composed, but her lipstick had been pressed together, freshly set. Victor came back through the main entrance 2 minutes after her, having circled through the side yard. I filed it all away, kept my face pleasant, and spent the rest of the evening doing what I did best, being the reliable, steady presence everyone expected. I chatted with Frank about his garden. I helped Norma find a corkscrew. I told a story at the dinner table that got a good laugh from the whole room. Lorraine watched me across the table with something in her expression I couldn't immediately name. Not guilt, not quite. More like unease. Like a woman who'd expected turbulence and couldn't figure out why the water was still calm. On the drive home, she was quiet for the first several miles. Then she asked, almost casually, "What did you think of Victor?" "Gary said he introduced you." "Seems like a capable man," I replied, eyes on the road. "Frank and Norma are lucky to have a good doctor looking after them." A pause. "He's been their physician for a long time." "So Gary said." She didn't push further. In the dark of the car, I heard her exhale slowly and I knew she was trying to read me the same way I'd been reading her all evening. She wouldn't find anything. Not yet. When we got home, I went directly to my study, closed the door, and opened my laptop. Within 20 minutes, I had Victor Rhodes's full professional profile. Cardiology practice on Meriwether Avenue, established 30 years ago, board certified, highly regarded, active in local charity circles. Well-respected, well-connected, and apparently, for God knows how long, well-acquainted with my wife. I closed the laptop, sat back, and made two decisions. First, I would hire someone to do what I no longer had the institutional resources to do myself. Second, I would not change a single thing about my behavior at home until I had something definitive in my hands. The auditor in me demanded evidence. The husband in me was already bracing for what that evidence would look like. I hired Dale Whitmore on a Tuesday morning. Dale was 63, former IRS investigator turned private consultant, and the kind of man who could follow a money trail through 4 shell companies without leaving fingerprints. We'd crossed paths twice during my Meridian years when our investigations overlapped. He was precise, discreet, and completely without sentiment. Exactly what I needed. We met at a coffee shop on Haywood Road, and I laid it out plainly. A name, a hotel key card, a pattern of behavior I needed confirmed. Dale listened with his hands wrapped around a ceramic mug, nodding at intervals. "How far back do you want me to go?" he asked when I finished. "Far as the records allow," I told him. He took the job without dramatics and told me he'd have a preliminary report within 10 days. I drove home feeling the particular calm of a man who has converted anxiety into action. There was still the matter of our own financial records, something I could handle myself, if Lorraine hadn't taken precautions. For the past year, she'd managed our household accounts, a task she'd taken over gradually after my retirement. The filing cabinet in her home office held our joint statements, organized by quarter. She kept that cabinet locked. I noticed it 6 months ago and accepted her explanation, protecting sensitive financial information. Reasonable, I'd thought at the time. Less reasonable now. That Friday, Lorraine left for what she described as a planning session with her church auxiliary committee. She was gone by 9:15. I gave it 10 minutes, then went to her office. The filing cabinet was locked, as expected. What wasn't expected was that her spare key, the one she kept in the ceramic dish on her desk, was gone. She'd moved it recently. Recently enough that she was already managing what I might look at. I stood there for a moment, hands in my pockets, looking at the cabinet with the same expression I used to wear in front of corporate ledgers that didn't balance. Then I went to the kitchen, retrieved the narrow flathead screwdriver I used for clock repair, and spent 4 minutes persuading the lock in the way an old auditor learns when he's worked with enough shady bookkeepers. The drawer slid open. The files were neat, labeled by year in Lorraine's careful handwriting. I started with the current year and worked backward. Hotel charges appeared immediately. The same mid-range property on the east side of the city, billed to our joint account every 2 to 3 weeks, going back further than I was prepared for. I pulled the files for the previous year. Same pattern. The year before that. I moved further back, pulling statements with growing deliberateness, spreading them across her desk in chronological order. The charges stretched back decades. I sat in her office chair and looked at what the numbers had laid out in front of me. A complete, unbroken record of a parallel life conducted on my dime. My hands were steady. I made that happen by concentrating on each individual page, one at a time, the way I used to concentrate on individual line items when a larger picture was too distorted to look at directly. I photographed every relevant page with my phone, returned the files to their exact positions, and resecured the lock. I left the room exactly as I found it. That evening, Lorraine came home and moved around the kitchen with her usual easy confidence, talking about the committee meeting, describing a disagreement over the holiday fundraiser schedule. I listened and responded at the right intervals. At one point, she walked past her office door, glanced in briefly, then continued to the kitchen. Her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. She checked. Everything looked untouched. "You seem quiet," she observed over dinner. "Long day," I replied. The Henderson's cabinet took longer to finish than I planned. I'd been refinishing it in the woodshop all afternoon, a truthful alibi I hadn't needed to manufacture. She accepted that and moved on. Later, in the woodshop after she'd gone to bed, I sat on my work stool and let the weight of what I'd found settle fully. Decades of charges, decades of weekend lies and refreshed lipstick, and the careful management of two separate lives. Cassie had been born during those years, raised during those years. And through all of it, Victor Rhodes had apparently remained a constant, just out of sight, just within reach. I opened my phone and sent Dale Whitmore a brief message. Accelerate the timeline. What you find will be worse than we thought. His reply came back in under a minute. Already is. Talk tomorrow. I set the phone down, picked up a piece of sandpaper, and worked the edge of the Hendersons' cabinet door until my hands stopped wanting to do something else entirely. Dale's report arrived on a Thursday, delivered in a plain manila envelope, left at my woodshop door before 7 in the morning. I waited until Lorraine left for her weekly yoga class before I opened it at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee. The surveillance photographs were clinical and thorough. Victor Rhodes and Lorraine in the parking structure of the Lakeview Suites. Lorraine entering first, Victor following 4 minutes later. Timestamps on every image. Dale had also pulled Victor's financial records through channels I didn't ask about. Charges at the same hotel on dates that mirrored Lorraine's absences precisely, going back 11 years that he could document. 11 years of confirmed records. The hotel charges in our joint accounts suggested the arrangement was considerably older. I set the photographs aside and turned to Dale's written summary. One paragraph near the end stopped me cold. Subject: Rhodes has no children, has never been married, maintains a 2-bedroom residence on Carteret Drive and a membership at Asheville Country Club. Of note, based on financial records, subject has received recurring personal transfers from a joint account matching the subject's initials, LH, averaging $400 monthly for approximately 8 years. I read that paragraph 3 times. Lorraine had been sending Victor Rhodes money. Not gifts, not shared expenses, recurring transfers. I pulled up our joint account on my phone and found the transaction category she'd labeled personal wellness. 8 years of monthly withdrawals. $38,000, give or take. I closed the app and finished my coffee. The DNA question had been in the back of my mind since the night I'd found the key card. I hadn't wanted to look at it directly. Now I had no choice. Cassie was 30. The hotel charges in our statements went back far enough to overlap with the year she was conceived. Victor Rhodes was exactly my age. That same afternoon, I ordered a home paternity test through a medical supply site. Discreet packaging, results in 14 days, accuracy certified at 99.97%. I stored in my locked desk drawer beneath a copy of an old audit report nobody would ever bother pulling out. Getting the sample from Cassie without explaining why took some careful thinking. The following Saturday, she came by the house for our standing lunch, the weekly ritual we'd maintained since she moved into her own apartment. I'd made her favorite grilled chicken and roasted vegetables. And afterward, while she sat at the kitchen counter going through photos on her phone, I cleared the table and quietly set her water glass aside rather than loading it directly into the dishwasher. She didn't notice. I packaged the samples that evening, sealed the envelope, and drove to the post office myself. On the way home, I stopped at the overlook on a mountain parkway where Lorraine and I had parked on our first real date, 35 years ago. I sat there for a while with the engine off, watching the city lights spread out below the ridge. 35 years. I'd built everything on the assumption that what we had was real. The house, the retirement, the woodshop, the quiet mornings, all of it rested on that foundation. And somewhere underneath it, apparently, was a crack that had been there since the beginning. I drove home, went to bed, and didn't sleep well. 14 days passed. I went through them with the mechanical regularity of a man who has learned to separate function from feeling. I finished the Hendersons' cabinet. I started a new project, a blanket chest for Cassie's birthday, which was 2 months out. I had dinner with Lorraine 4 times, helped Frank with a leaking pipe fitting, attended a neighborhood association meeting. On the 14th evening, I waited until the house was empty, Lorraine at her book club, and opened the results on my laptop. The language was exact and unhurried, the way lab reports always are. Based on the analysis of 22 genetic markers, the tested male is excluded as the biological father of the tested female. Probability of paternity, 0%.
I have to pause right here. 30 years of being a father, and he finds out the truth alone at his kitchen table on a quiet evening. I can't imagine carrying that.
I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then I closed the laptop, stood up, and walked to the woodshop. I turned on every light, selected a piece of cherry wood I'd been saving for something worthy, and began measuring. My hands were precise. My cuts were clean. I worked until midnight. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon while I was in the woodshop. I didn't recognize the number, but I recognized the voice immediately. Measured, practiced, carrying the particular confidence of a man who was accustomed to controlling the terms of a conversation. Winston, this is Victor Rhodes. I think it's time we talked. I set down my chisel and leaned against the workbench. Outside, a cold December wind pushed against the shop windows. I let 3 full seconds pass before answering. Victor, I said evenly. I was wondering when you'd call. A brief pause. He'd expected either anger or alarm, and gotten neither. I prefer to meet in person. There are things you should hear directly from me. Is that right? I replied. Things like what exactly? Things that would be better discussed privately. His tone shifted slightly, not softer, but more deliberate. I'm not your enemy, Winston. I didn't say you were. I picked up my chisel again and examined the edge. Merryweather coffee. Tomorrow. 10 o'clock. Another pause. Fine. 10 o'clock. I hung up and stood there for a moment, turning the chisel slowly in my hands. Victor Rhodes had just made his first mistake, and a significant one. He'd reached out before I'd made any move against him. That meant either Lorraine had told him I was asking questions, or he'd grown impatient waiting for a confrontation that hadn't come. Either way, he'd shown me that the silence was getting to him. Good. I arrived at Merryweather Coffee 12 minutes early and selected a corner table with my back to the wall. Old habit. I was halfway through my Americano when Victor walked in at 10:05, silver hair immaculate, wool overcoat pressed, every inch the distinguished physician. He ordered at the counter and carried his cup to the table with a steady hand. I gave him credit for that. He sat down, took a measured sip, and looked at me directly. I assume you know about Lorraine and me. I know considerably more than you'd be comfortable with, I replied. Something shifted in his expression, not quite alarm, but a recalibration. He'd rehearsed an opening. I just made it obsolete. I want you to understand, he began, that I never intended. Victor, I set my cup down. I spent 32 years tracking down men who never intended to do what the evidence proved they'd done. Save that speech for someone it'll work on. His jaw tightened. Then he leaned forward slightly, and what I saw in his eyes surprised me. Not guilt, but something harder. Possession. She's been with me for longer than you want to know, he said quietly. That's not going to change because you found a key card. There it was. The arrogance underneath the polished surface. I looked at him for a long moment. This man who had spent decades treating patients with careful authority and apparently conducting himself the same way in the rest of his life. Let me explain something to you, I said, my voice dropping to the register I used when I wanted every word to land precisely. You didn't call me because you want to clear the air. You call me because you're nervous. And you should be, because what I've assembled over the past several weeks isn't a suspicion. It's a documented record, financial, photographic, and otherwise. So whatever you came here to negotiate, you've come to the wrong table. Victor stared at me. The confident posture held, but the easy authority behind his eyes had gone somewhere quieter. What do you want? He asked finally. Right now? Nothing from you. I picked up my cup. That's the part you're going to find hardest to accept. I finished my coffee, stood, left enough on the table to cover both drinks, and walked out without looking back. My hands were steady. My pulse was where it belonged. On the drive home, I allowed myself one moment of something close to satisfaction. Not at Victor's discomfort, but at my own clarity. He'd walked into that meeting expecting to manage me. Instead, he confirmed everything I needed to know about his character. And he'd done it in under 15 minutes. That evening, Lorraine came home from her book club and found me reading in the armchair. She stood in the doorway for a moment, studying me with the careful attention of a woman waiting for whether she knows is coming. "Good book?" she asked. "Getting there," I answered, turning a page. "How was book club?" "Fine," she replied, but her voice carried a thin edge of something strained. Victor had already called her. I was certain of it. Let them both wonder. The auditor in me had all the numbers. The husband in me had made his decision. All that remained was the right moment to present the findings, cleanly, completely, and on my terms alone. Dennis Fowler lived 40 minutes outside Asheville in a cedar-sided house on a lake that had once been the envy of his professional circle. That was before the divorce. I hadn't seen Dennis in 8 months, not since his retirement party, where he'd drunk too much bourbon and told anyone who'd listened that his ex-wife had taken everything that mattered and left him everything that hadn't. He was 66, formerly the senior partner at a mid-size investment firm, and the sharpest mind I'd known in 30 years of financial work. He met me at the door in a flannel shirt and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, a can of beer already in hand at 2 in the afternoon. The inside of the house told the rest of the story. Furniture pushed to the walls, as though someone had started rearranging and lost interest. Rectangles of slightly brighter paint where framed photos had once hung. A kitchen counter stacked with unopened mail. The place had the specific atmosphere of a man who had stopped caring about the surface of things. I sat across from Dennis at the kitchen table and laid out what I had: the financial records, Dale's surveillance report, the DNA result. I didn't editorialize. I presented the facts the way I always presented facts. Dennis listened with his elbows on the table, turning his beer can slowly between his palms. When I finished, he let out a long breath. "How long?" he asked. "Decades," I said. He nodded slowly, as though confirming something he'd already suspected. Patricia did the same to me. 15 years with a man from her tennis club. I found out through a credit card statement. A restaurant charge on a Tuesday afternoon when she'd told me she was at her sister's. "What did you do?" Dennis looked up. A brightness entered his eyes that had nothing warm in it. "I exposed her. Completely. Called her family, called our mutual friends, showed up at her sister's birthday dinner with a printed summary of every lie she'd told for 15 years. He set the can down. "You know what it got me? I waited. 2 years of legal warfare. A settlement that cost me this house basically in spirit, if not in deed, and a daughter who spoke to me twice in the following year." He gestured at the empty walls. The people I thought would respect me for telling the truth mostly just wanted the drama to stop. And Patricia, she walked through it and came out the other side with the sympathy vote, if you can believe it. I looked around the room. The cold afternoon light came through the lake-facing window and landed on all the empty spaces. "Do you regret it?" I asked. Dennis was quiet for a moment. "I regret how I did it. I don't regret knowing the truth." He looked at me steadily. "But I'll tell you this, Winston, if I had it to do over, I'd have taken my time. Done on my terms, not out of rage. The rage made me sloppy, and sloppy cost me. I drove home along the ridge road with the windows cracked despite the cold, turning Dennis's words over in my mind the entire way. He'd handed me something useful, not a roadmap to follow, but a clear picture of what one version of this road looked like after you traveled it. By the time I pulled into my driveway, several things had clarified themselves. First, I would not be contacting Lorraine's family or her social circle. Public destruction was Dennis's approach, and the debris field it had created was visible from 40 miles away. Second, I needed to speak with Cassie before I took any formal step. She deserved to hear certain things from me directly, not secondhand and not after the fact. Third, and this one had been sitting at the edge of my thinking for days, waiting for me to look at it squarely. There was a woman named Mrs. Victor Rhodes, except there wasn't one. Victor had never married, so there was no innocent party on that side of the equation to consider or protect. There was only Lorraine, and the reckoning she had coming was going to be on my schedule, in my language, in a setting of my choosing. I went inside, made a pot of coffee, and called Cassie. She answered on the second ring. "Dad, everything okay? I need to see you," I told her. "This weekend. Just the two of us." A pause. Then, quietly, "I'll be there Saturday morning." "Good," I said. "I'll make breakfast." I made her favorite breakfast: scrambled eggs with sharp cheddar, sourdough toast, strong coffee. Simple food, the kind I'd been making for her since she was old enough to sit at the kitchen counter on a stool and watch. Cassie arrived at 8:15, still wearing her winter coat, cheeks red from the cold. She hugged me at the door, longer than usual, and didn't say anything until she'd settled onto a stool with both hands around a coffee mug. Lorraine was at her sister's for the weekend. I'd made sure of that before picking the day. I set a plate in front of Cassie and sat across the counter from her. Then I laid it out the way I'd laid out every difficult finding in my career, directly, in sequence, without softening the edges into something unrecognizable. The key card, the surveillance report, the financial records, the DNA test. Cassie didn't interrupt. She listened with the focused stillness of someone absorbing information they've been half expecting and half dreading. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, both hands still wrapped around her mug. "The DNA test," she said finally, her voice careful and even. "You're certain?" 99.97% certain, I replied, which in practical terms means certain. She nodded slowly, set the mug down, looked at the countertop for a moment, then back at me. "Does that change anything for you?" "About me?" I held her gaze. "Not a single thing. You're my daughter. That's not a biological designation. It's 30 years of evidence, and evidence is what I know how to read." Something in her face shifted. Not relief exactly. More like the release of a tension she'd been carrying without knowing how heavy it was. Her eyes went bright for a moment, and she blinked it back. "I've suspected something was off for a while," she admitted. "Little things. The way Mom acted around Dr. Rhodes at Grandma and Grandpa's last year. The way she talked about him, too carefully, like she was measuring every word. You never said anything." "Neither did you," she replied, and there was no accusation in it. Just the observation of two people who had both been watching the same slow-moving thing. I nodded. "Fair enough. What are you going to do?" she asked. "I've already spoken to an attorney. The filing will happen in the next 2 weeks." I refilled her coffee. "I'm telling you now, so you hear it from me first, not from your mother's version of events." Cassie was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to tell her about the DNA? About Victor being—" She stopped. "No," I said. "That's not a truth that serves you or her relationship with Lorraine. Victor Rhodes is a fact of your biology. I am a fact of your life. Those are two different things, and only one of them matters." She looked at me steadily for a long time. Then she stood, came around the counter, and put her arms around me the way she had when she was small and something at school had gone wrong. I held on and said nothing. The kitchen was warm and quiet and smelled like coffee and toast, and for a few minutes that was exactly enough. After breakfast, we sat on the back porch with our second cups despite the cold, watching the bare trees in the yard move in the December wind. We talked about her work, her apartment, a trip she was considering in the spring. Normal things. Important things. Before she left, she stopped at the door and turned back. "Dad," she said, "for what it's worth, you handled this the way I'd want a man to handle it. No spectacle, no collateral damage. Just the truth in the right order to the right people." I squeezed her shoulder. "Go drive safe." I watched her car until it turned the corner. Then I went back inside, washed the dishes, and called my attorney to confirm the filing date. The dinner was Lorraine's idea. She'd suggested it the previous week. A quiet meal at Castellano's, our standing anniversary restaurant. I agreed without hesitation. She interpreted my willingness as a positive sign. I let her. We were seated at a corner table, the same one we'd occupied for our 25th anniversary 9 years earlier. Lorraine ordered the salmon. I ordered the ribeye. We talked through the appetizers, about Frank's recent checkup, about a neighbor's renovation project, about nothing that mattered. Halfway through the main course, I reached into my jacket and placed a plain manila envelope on the table between us. Lorraine looked at it without touching it. "What is that?" "Everything," I answered simply. She set down her fork. Her eyes moved from the envelope to my face, reading me with the particular focus of a woman who had spent 32 years learning my expressions. Whatever she found there told her enough. She didn't reach for the envelope immediately. "Winston, you should look at it," I said, keeping my voice low and even. Take your time. She opened it slowly. I watched her work through the contents, the hotel photographs, the financial summary, the DNA result on top. Her face moved through several things in the space of a minute. Recognition, a flash of something desperate, then a careful, deliberate composure that told me she'd been rehearsing for this possibility longer than I'd been investigating it. This isn't what it looks like, she began. Lorraine, I set down my fork. The woman who says that is the woman in those photographs at that hotel for the past 11 confirmed years. So let's skip that part. Her composure developed a fracture along the edges. I can explain the money. I know what the money was for. I cut in quietly. What I'd like you to explain is the decision to let me raise a child for 30 years without knowing the truth. That's the part one keep returning to. Silence. The restaurant murmured quietly around us. I thought, she started. I thought you'd leave. And I couldn't, her voice faltered. You were a good father, Winston. The best she could have had. That wasn't your decision to make on my behalf, I replied. I deserve to know what my own life actually was. You took that from me for 3 decades. Lorraine looked down at the table. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. Are you going to tell Cassie? I've already spoken with Cassie, I answered. She knows what she needs to know. The color left Lorraine's face entirely. She's fine, I added, reading her panic accurately. And she'll continue to be fine, because I'm going to make sure of that. I folded my napkin with the same deliberate care I'd used since my first boardroom meeting. My attorney will be in contact next week. I've already arranged to stay at the residence on Birchwood. There won't be a legal battle if you choose not to make one. I want an equitable division, a clean process, and minimal disruption to Cassie. Lorraine stared at me. That's it? 32 years, and you're just. You ended this, I said, without heat, without volume. Every time you drove to that hotel. Every month you transferred money to his account. Every day you chose not to tell me the truth about my daughter. I'm not ending anything. I'm reading the final balance on a ledger you've been keeping for 3 decades. She had no answer for that. I signaled for the check, paid it, helped her with her coat out of habit and nothing else, and drove home in a silence that felt, for the first time in months, completely honest. The attorney's name was Philip Garner, and he'd been handling complicated divorces in Asheville for 26 years. He was precise, unhurried, and completely without drama, qualities I respected and had specifically selected for. He filed the paperwork on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, Lorraine had been served. She called me that evening from her sister's house, where she'd retreated the day after our dinner at Castellanos. Her voice was tight, controlled, somewhere between fury and genuine distress. You didn't give me any time, she said. I gave you 32 years, I replied. I think that's a reasonable runway. A pause. Then, with an edge I hadn't heard from her in a long time. Philip Garner is a shark, Winston. You're signaling that you want to fight. Philip Garner is thorough, I answered calmly, which is exactly what I need. If you retain someone equally thorough and we both instruct them to resolve this fairly, it'll be over in 3 months. If you instruct yours to complicate it, then it'll take longer and cost both of us more. That's entirely your decision. She was quiet for a moment. I could hear her breathing, the deliberate, controlled rhythm of a woman working to keep her composure on the phone. What about Victor? She asked finally. The question surprised me. Not the content, but the directness of it. She was asking what I intended to do about him publicly. Victor Rhodes is your concern now, I told her. I have no interest in his reputation or his practice. What I had was a marriage, and that's what I'm dissolving. He doesn't factor into my plans. Another silence. You're being remarkably calm about this. I've had time to process it, I said. You've had considerably less. That's the natural consequence of being the one who was deceived. The call ended shortly after. Lorraine retained her own attorney. Not a shark, as it turned out, but a competent family law practitioner named Hollis who apparently advised her, correctly, that contesting an equitable division with this level of documented evidence was an exercise in expensive futility. The process moved forward. 3 weeks later, Cassie called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice carrying a careful steadiness that told me she'd been thinking about what she was going to say before she dialed. "I saw Mom today," she said. "She asked me about Victor." I waited. She wanted to know if I blamed her for who my biological father is. Cassie paused. I told her that wasn't the part one was struggling with. The part one was struggling with was 30 years of a lie that affected Dad more than it ever affected me. Another pause. She cried. I let her, but I didn't take it back. "You don't have to take anything back," I said. "I know." Her voice steadied further. I also told her that whatever happens between you two, you're my father. Not a biological fact, not a legal designation. My father. And that's not going to change based on her decisions. I sat with that for a moment. "Thank you, Cass." "Don't thank me," she replied, and I could hear the quiet firmness in it. "It's just the truth." As for Victor Rhodes, he attempted one more contact. A letter delivered to my woodshop address, written in the measured language of a man accustomed to presenting difficult information with clinical composure. It outlined, with remarkable self-assurance, his belief that Cassie had a right to know he existed as her biological father, and that he hoped I wouldn't stand in the way of that possibility. I read it twice. Then I shredded it, swept the bits into the bin beneath my workbench, and went back to the blanket chest I was building for Cassie's birthday. If Cassie ever chose to pursue that connection on her own terms and in her own time, that was her right entirely. It was not Victor's right to initiate, and it was certainly not something he got to negotiate with me. I didn't respond to the letter. Silence, in that instance, was the most precise answer available. The divorce was finalized on a gray Wednesday in February. Philip called me with the confirmation while I was in the woodshop, sanding the lid of Cassie's blanket chest. I thanked him, hung up, and stood there for a moment with the sandpaper in my hand. 32 years, a number that felt enormous and, in the same breath, strangely manageable. Because what I was left with wasn't wreckage. It was the solid, documented truth of a life I'd actually lived. The daughter I'd raised. The work I'd done. The man I'd remained throughout all of it. That was the final balance. And it held. 9 months after the divorce was finalized, I moved into a house on Ridgecroft Lane, a single-story craftsman with a large detached workshop and a backyard that caught the afternoon sun until nearly 5 o'clock in November. The workshop was the first room I furnished completely. Cassie came by on moving day with her boyfriend and a truck full of energy, directing the placement of furniture with the same decisive efficiency she brought to her architecture work. By evening, the kitchen was functional, the bedroom was livable, and the workshop held every tool in its proper place on the pegboard wall I'd installed that morning. We ordered pizza and ate on the back steps as the sun went down behind the ridge. "This is a good house," Cassie said, looking out at the yard. "It suits me," I agreed. She leaned her shoulder against mine briefly, a small gesture, the kind that doesn't require commentary. I had seen Lorraine twice since the finalization, once at Frank and Norma's Christmas gathering, which I attended for the older couple's sake and nothing else, and once outside the attorney's office when we signed the final asset division paperwork. Both times she had looked at me with an expression I recognized, the look of a person who has gotten what they thought they wanted and discovered the cost of it in the aftermath. Victor had indeed moved into her condo, as mutual acquaintances had mentioned in passing. I wished neither of them anything in particular. They were simply no longer part of my accounting. Dennis Fowler called me in October, 8 months after our lake house conversation. His voice sounded different, quieter, more measured. He'd started seeing a therapist, he said. His daughter Rebecca had reached out. They'd had dinner twice. "You were right not to go the public route," he told me. "I've been watching what you did from the outside, and it was the right way. It was the only way for me," I replied. "Might not be the right way for everyone." "Maybe," Dennis said, "but it was right for Cassie. And that counts for more than most things." He wasn't wrong. Cassie's birthday fell on a Saturday in April. I drove to her apartment with the blanket chest in the back of my truck, wrapped in moving blankets against the early spring chill. She opened it in her living room, running her hands along the dovetail joints at the corners, the smooth cherry finish, the hand-forged hinges I'd sourced from a metalworker in Tennessee. "Dad," she said quietly, it'll hold quilts," I told her, "or whatever you want." She looked up from the chest with the bright, direct eyes she'd had since she was 3 years old. You made this while all of that was happening. I needed somewhere to put my hands, I said simply. She hugged me in the middle of her living room, hard and unhurried. Then she pulled back and looked at me with an expression that held something I didn't have a precise word for, something between pride and recognition, the particular look of a daughter seeing her father clearly and finding the view steady. You're going to be okay, she said. I already am, I told her. I drove home along the ridge road in the late afternoon light, windows down, the smell of spring coming off the hills. At 61 years old, I was starting over in a house of my own choosing, with a workshop I'd built the way I wanted it, and a daughter who knew the full truth of who I was and had decided that was more than enough. The numbers, for the first time in a long time, balanced completely.
Winston had every reason to be bitter, and he chose dignity instead. That's not weakness. That's the hardest thing a man can do. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.